previous slide we saw, I was able to bring down my import dependence to 49.5%, which was around this figure, around 10,000 terawatt hours in 2047. So I start from there. Then I say in the present policy scenario, my coal production will only increase to 1120 million tons, which I need to increase to 1571 million tons, deploying technologies from across South Africa or Australia for that matter, increase productivity of coal mines. So let's say monopoly of Coal India Limited is dismantled, private sector participation is allowed in the coal sector. So my coal production increase will contribute to 40% of the reduction in import dependence. Then increase in bioenergy, or especially the biofuels from microalgae, macroalgae, and second generation fossil fuels are going to contribute another 28 to 30% in the reduction in import dependence, and then increase in gas production from 127 BCM to 224 BCM. So the takeaway is I need to sort of increase my coal production by 3 times from the present level. So presently we are at 550 million tons, so I need to increase it to 1571 million tons. Then I need to increase in bioenergy supply. I need to increase my bioenergy supply to 44 million tons. That will involve production from microalgae and macroalgae, and then increase my gas production. So these are my 3 sectors which I can focus upon, and then rest is they all contribute to some extent, and because of which. So this was my import dependence after demand sector interventions, 49.5%. I'm able to bring it down to 21%, which is moderate carbon energy security. And my emissions per capita come down to 3.3, right? Or there's another choice which I face, so I can put India onto another trajectory, which is low carbon or renewable intensive energy security. When I say that my import dependence, I will be able to bring down my import dependence to in fact 15%, right? And emissions per capita will further come down to 2.7 tons per capita. But then it will involve a lot of heroic interventions, both on the demand side and the supply side, when we say that we need to phase out coal power plants by 2022 in India, which is a very difficult decision to make. But as we will see in the next slide, the kind of decision that we make today is going to make, design a future in 2040, 2050. So which is why, these long-term modeling approaches are really useful. So if I go for a low carbon intensive energy security, then my renewables will contribute almost 40 to 50% in bringing down my import dependence. Of course, it assumes that I have sufficient manufacturing capacities available in India. We are not importing, let's say, solar panels or wind turbines to compensate for importing oil or gas. So in all these 2 scenarios, what's going to be my installed solar capacity? So I'll skip that just in the interest of time. Yeah, so this slide is particularly important, which says my installed thermal capacity. So this blue line is the present policy scenario when I'll be staring at 550 gigawatts of coal thermal power capacity additions. The red line is maximum energy security or moderate carbon energy security, and this green line is minimum emissions or low carbon energy security. So my coal thermal capacities need to peak by 2037. This is what it advocates if we are to follow the low carbon energy security pathway. Then my coal demand also needs to peak around 2042 if we are to achieve our low carbon energy security goals. Then this is my import dependence. Now this is one key slide which I put just in the morning, and it does talks about so macroeconomic models and energy models underestimate the cost of fossil fuel intensive energy security. Even if we don't account for external costs, for example, health costs has been talked about, or emissions cost or pollution costs. Even if we don't account for that, then too these models tend to overestimate or underestimate the cost of energy security. We have not put in cost as of yet, but we'll be putting in the next 2 or 3 months, as pointed out by Dr. Kathuria in the morning. The share of coal in the industry, so in the present policy scenario, as we say that if all the present policies are implemented, the share of coal in industry is likely to rise from 29% to 35%, right? While power sector, of course, is on the trajectory of efficiency gains. So industry will be the driver of my coal in 2047. And then coal import dependence will rise from 17% to 62%. So coal import dependence will almost shoot up 4 times. And so this is a slide I prepared on coal. I can prepare a similar slide on oil to reflect the true cost of fossil fuel intensive energy security for any country. Then, this is again an assumption-based exercise, so you can change those assumptions. From our understanding, we find that coal supply may peak in 2037 in the present policy scenario in India. And we say that 80% of the domestic thermal capacities based on coal will come online from now to 2047. So on one side, you have a peaking coal production supply in the country, and on the other side, you're saying that to meet our developmental targets, 80% of the coal thermal capacities will be added in the next 30 years. Second is, investment lock-ins, which we sort of neglect, is the kind of decisions I make for those 80% coal thermal capacity which are to come online in the next 35 years, be in terms of transport infrastructure, be in terms of import terminals that I'll be building, be in terms of railway tracks which I'll be laying. The asset life of that infrastructure is more than 50 years, so it runs into 60 years, 70 years. So as a country, if we make the choice on fossil fuel intensive energy security, we want to lock us down in the next for the next 40, 50 years in a particular fashion. And if God forbids if we have to take some really key policy decisions on climate change that time, the cost of taking those decisions on climate change then 10 years, 20 years, or 30 years down the line will be even larger than the cost that we can encounter today, right? So we cannot just wish away the kind of infrastructure that we will be building on oil, gas, and coal in the next 30 years. It will be there. So the cost of scrapping the infrastructure and going for low carbon energy security then will be even more than trying to take a judicious call now. So, and again, so it's not a rosy story for renewables either. If we go for renewable energy intensive security, do we have enough manufacturing capacities available in the country? So this is the kind of trade-offs that a country needs to have, and the takeaway would be the decisions that we make today is going to determine our future for the next 40 to 50 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Himanshu, for very clearly outlining the story here that it's coal, but is it dirty or is it clean coal? I'll now turn to Shrikant to talk about the final report on the expert group on the low carbon strategies for inclusive growth. Are some of the stories that are coming out from that report very similar to or very different from what Himanshu has talked about?
Thank you. Thank you, Shaun. Thank you, Rajat, for adding me to the panel. My day job is as an economist at the Delhi School. I spend a lot of time doing integrated assessment models, running regressions. My co-author is here, Professor Partha Sen. Here I'm going to say three things. I'll make 3 points. First, as Shaun said, I'll try to comment on the models. I'll also talk a little bit about the politics or the geopolitics of low carbon growth. And then, as Mrs. Kidwai, who's not here, said that we need an alternative paradigm beyond the clean development mechanism. So I'll talk a little bit about an international market-based paradigm for a global low carbon growth. My friend Navroz is obviously much more up with the international negotiations, and he's taken you through some nice acronyms. So I'll be little less nuanced about my take on what's happening in the international scenario. So first on the models. I think we are being a little dishonest in this session, because we've been talking about things like green growth is good. I see this nice banner, green is great. Green is great, but green is not free. Green costs money. And I think the Kirit Parikh committee report, which was called the report of the expert committee on low carbon growth, which at some point Navroz resigned from, so he'll tell us why. But the point is the report was about 4 years late. and has a number of flaws, and I won't really go into detail. I've written about that on a blog. But the point is that I think one of the very useful things that the report did, which Mr. Ahluwalia was mentioning in the morning, is that using a kind of a macro model for the economy, this report, well, let me tell you a little bit about the way the report was put together. There was an interim report. The committee was set up in 2010, January, and they were supposed to bring out the report in September 2010. The final report was published in May 2014, 6 days before the new government came. They put out an interim report in 2011. The final report and the interim report are really no different. The interim report had a lot of sectors talking of the kinds of things that Himanshu was talking about. A very bottom-up technological approach. Let's do this, let's do that, with no costs in it. It was all about technologies. What the final version of the report did is it grafted on a macro model, existing work, published work, and nonetheless, I don't want to quibble with it. I just want to say that it was still useful because it had some headline numbers. And if you want to take away one number from this meeting, then I would say take that away. They said that if India did all these wonderful things, some of the ones that Himanshu mentioned, we went heavily for renewables, nuclear, we had supercritical in coal, it's going to cost the Indian economy cumulatively over about 20 years, from 2011 to 2030, something like $1.3 trillion. That's $1,344 billion. Of course, the economics in the report was rather poor. They didn't even bother to discount over this time period. But nonetheless, the usefulness of that report, of that chapter in the report, and there are similar models done by other groups, has basically been to say that, look guys, we all talk about this low carbon growth. Mrs. Kidwai said it's good for business. It's good for some businesses, not all. The point is that there is a price tag to it. It doesn't come free. And so the subtext, or well, not the subtext, the text of the report was that where is this money going to come from? So that was really what the report was about. There's a lot more detail to it, and we can discuss that in the Q&A. But the bottom line is that green growth is not free. We are going to be very dishonest if we believe in this Michael Porter kind of world. He's a Harvard business guru, wealth from waste and all these kinds of buzzwords. There is some of that, but on the net, India has a lot of coal, and ideally we should be burning it. If you want to use very clean technologies, either not use coal or use coal in a very clean way, there's a price tag to it, and the question remains, where will the funds come from? Because India certainly has other important things to do as well in other spheres. Talking about the kind of things that ICRIER is planning to do now in the next few months, let me be the devil's advocate again and say that, look, what you are going to be doing is essentially a bottom-up approach. You use the word Excel spreadsheets. So obviously when you're doing an Excel spreadsheet, unless you have a fully optimized model in your Excel spreadsheet, you're going to sort of take different sectors, make certain assumptions, and then add up. And you did, I'm happy to hear that you did mention the word cost. Otherwise I was getting worried that this would be another, Kirit Parikh committee report kind of sectoral scenarios. I'm not trying to be pejorative. All I'm trying to say is that it's all very good to say, for example, and we have one of the leading urban transport experts here, Professor Mohan. It's all very good to say, oh, we must all move towards public transport or non-motorized transport. There are two questions. The first is, what is the kind of policies that will make us move out of our cars into these things? The policy framework is very important, and there again the Kirit Parikh committee report came up very short, because it just sort of hand-waved on policy in a very perfunctory manner towards the end. And the second point is that it's still going to cost a lot of money. So we need to quantify all that in a very honest and sincere way. And I really don't think that bottom-up models really cut it. What you really need is an integration of a top-down and a bottom-up approach. The top-down is a big macro model, and the usefulness of that model, howsoever crude and rudimentary they may be, as in the report I was mentioning. The point is they look at interactions between different sectors of the economy. there are substitutions. So it's not just that it's what economists in jargon call partial equilibrium. That, yeah, I'm going to do this to coal. Well, what you're going to do to coal will have, interfuel substitutions and all kinds of ramifications, which cannot be captured in a spreadsheet-based bottom-up model. Nonetheless, the importance of the bottom-up models is that those models must inform the top-down model. The top-down model of the kind that is in chapter 2 of the grafted onto the into the CRIER committee report in chapter 2 is essentially saying its assumptions are totally divorced from the rest of the report. So you really need good sectoral work to feed into a macro model, and I hope that at some point in time ICRIER will undertake that exercise, which would be quite useful and meaningful, and it certainly will take a lot more time than the time frame that you have in mind. I am really worried now about the geopolitics of low carbon growth. I always wonder, why is it that all of a sudden we have all these foreign governments very concerned about India's low carbon growth? Let's be very blunt. In in December 2015, COP21, the Conference of Parties of the UN Convention, as Navroz mentioned, will be meeting in Paris. So that's about, what, 17 months away. There's huge pressure on India particularly to take on some kinds of targets or some kinds of commitments. Navroz was mentioning this INDC. What was it, Navroz? You're really good at this. What's it? Intended nationally determined contributions. There was another similar jargon which was called NAMA. Any people know NAMAs here, right? Nationally appropriate mitigation actions. The bottom line is that there is this great nudge to get us to mitigate without any commensurate, honest attempt to put international finance on the table. There is a huge pressure, and I think as Navroz was mentioning, our approach to international negotiations has been rather naive. We've been beating on this historical responsibility business. We have not done as good a PR job as China of selling our work on whatever work we do on carbon mitigation. And long story short, India is being seen as one of the holdouts, and the point is that there is a huge political subtext to it. And I would urge you to very, very seriously think about this. Recently, the French minister was here. You had the UK minister today, and you have a number of these countries who are now trying to engage with us in mitigation. And I think there is a real subtext here, and there is a real worry here. Because what is in our national interest? Is it in our national interest to take on unilateral mitigation? I don't think so. I really don't think. What's in our national interest is to invest in adaptation. Mitigation to the extent that maybe we reduce our dependence on imported oil. Maybe that may be a reason to do it. What we do for our local sort of policies, maybe we move to public transport because, again, it reduces dependence on oil and so on, is fine. But I think mitigation for the sake of mitigation is problematic, and I think I really am very worried about this very sort of altruistic interest that the advanced countries are taking in our low carbon growth, and I really think that there is more to it than meets the eye. Just the last thing that then I would like to say here is that if we really want to engage with the world on climate mitigation, how could we possibly do it? We could possibly do it by taking part in a global system of emissions trading, which at the same time meets our equity needs by saying that the initial allocation of these is done on the basis of certain maybe per capita entitlement. So the global commons can be divided on some equitable basis. The subtext obviously of that is that we would get a larger share of the global commons, but that makes the trading more transparent rather than sort of going with a kind of a bowl in front of the countries and saying, oh, well, we need to mitigate and give us some money. So with that in mind, I'm just going to very, very quickly run you through a couple of slides. Firstly, please keep the context in mind. India may be a big emitter, but India is not a big contributor to the problem, because the problem of greenhouse gases, and I think it's something that really worth repeating, because even an August panel such as the IPCC doesn't seem to really get it at times. It's a stock problem. Stocks and flows, I suppose everybody understands income is a flow, wealth is a stock. The problem of climate change is the accumulated stock of CO2 emissions. And even if today the China was quote unquote the biggest polluter, that's really incorrect, because it may be contributing to emissions, but the historical contribution is very, very disproportionate, as these numbers show. And I think this is well understood by some, but often forgotten. So the idea about big emitters, I think, should be replaced with big contributors. And contributors is an accumulative historical sense. There are time lags in climate response. I'm going to skip this slide, but the idea is that we all agree that we should move very quickly. The problem is who does what, how much, how soon, and who pays for it. So I think that's the real problem. The view of economists, which is very simple, is that there must be a global carbon price, and this price must be uniform. And lest you think that, you know, here comes this prof from the university to tell us this. This is actually also an IPCC view. This is from the previous assessment report. Though I was a part of the 5th assessment report, the mitigation report, I'm not a great fan of that report. I thought the 4th assessment report was much clearer in the messaging it made, at least on the economics of it. And the messaging was very clear that you have to have a carbon price signal. The range is very broad. It's anywhere between $20 to $80, but that's where the research is needed. I think that's where high quality research on integrated assessment models would work, and I think that's where we need high quality research in India too, and I think that I would really urge organizations such as ICRIER to sort of invest in that. The point then is that price signals are always very important. Prices matter. What you're seeing here in this graph is effectively a kind of an energy price on the vertical axis. You're seeing energy intensity. Countries that price energy low are more energy intensive. This is real data, it's fitted data. So what effectively you're seeing is something like a demand curve. And I think the importance of price signals cannot be underestimated. The price signal has to be global. So we have to have a global trading system. Mr. Ahluwalia was mentioning that Australia has abandoned a carbon tax. The point is, either you have a tax or a trading system, you need a certain mechanism. The only trading system we have in place now is the EU emissions trading system, which is really flawed and is not working well, but nonetheless, that's in place. And the idea here is that if you have abatement costs of two different countries, say the MAC of the North and the MAC of the South, a cost-effective allocation would equate the marginal abatement costs. I'll give you a very quick illustration. I think I'm on my second last slide here. These are figures literally on a back of the envelope by Lord Nick Stern, because I think now he's Lord and he does lots of back of envelope stuff. And the point is that the per capita emissions of about average 7 tons per year, give or take. We are about 6 billion people. Mr. Ahluwalia was mentioning 2 tons, and so he's pretty much right. You halving the total emissions. When you halve total emissions, but since there are going to be more people on the planet, so you can do the arithmetic, and you'll get 2 to 3 tons per person. The US is at present sitting on 20 tons, give or take. EU, Singapore, about 10 tons, China, 3.5, India, 1.1, 1.4, the decimals really, so we can quibble about the decimal point. The point is that what I'm really trying to suggest here is that the Indian negotiating position should be informed. So there's no harm for India to accept a cap on emissions, as long as the cap is consistent with the growth objectives, as long as the cap is consistent with some equitable sharing of the carbon space. So for example, if we were to get a cap of 3 tons per person, it will not be hot air. meaning we don't have less than what we are entitled to. We're not emitting less because our emissions are also going to grow. But the point then remains is that you have here a transparent market-based system for determining resource allocations across the globe, rather than going with a begging bowl to the international community and saying, oh, well, you know, you must give us money for international finance. Those of you who are old enough here, like me, would remember that the rich countries had once promised 0.7% of GDP as official domestic assistance long back. And I think barring a few small Scandinavian countries, they never ever came close to it. So if we think that out of the goodness of their heart, the rich countries are going to transfer billions of dollars to us to mitigate, I think we are living in a fool's paradise. I think the only way we can have a global agreement, we can have resources that we legitimately need for our growth, is if we have a transparent allocation mechanism based on a global cap and trade, where we legitimately can ask for a bigger share of the pie. This is Econ 101. This is the kind of economics that Rajat and I learned at the University of Maryland. The problem with Western economists is that they preach the gospel, but when the gospel becomes inimical to their own interests in terms of resource transfer. So we were always taught that, look, initial allocation doesn't matter for the efficiency property of trading systems. But then initial allocation has huge political implications. And then the market economics sort of, you know, starts kind of backtracking. So I think I will end with my last slide, which is that the agreement is ultimately about money. Lord Stern talks about $50–100 billion, probably bigger, but it could be a win-win. I really don't like that word, but it still could be a win-win, because the North would get cheaper abatement options in the South. The North can't buy its way out because it will have to also cut emissions at home, and the South takes on binding targets. I can elaborate on these ideas a bit more, but I would really, again, to summarize, say, modeling exercise in our country are important if they're done right and are of high quality, and that could only happen if we integrate the bottom up and the top down approaches. The geopolitics of low carbon growth are really worrying. We will, I have one prediction to make. As we go along in the next 15 months, we'll see lots of other rich countries coming to us talking about low carbon growth. So just be